Kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome back to another edition of Big Hairy News. Just me tonight, and I'm here virtually. Ooh. I'm actually at my daughter's, what do they call it? It's not graduation, prize giving. That's what we call it in New Zealand, prize giving for her last day of secondary school before she heads off to university. So you get me virtually tonight, but you get some pretty cool clips coming up for you as we go through the show. Want to just also say to you, huge thanks for those people who have been involved in our merch drop for this month. Quite a few people have been jumping on board in the last 24 hours, and I assume that's because we're about to close down the bottom feeder gear. If you're interested in getting some of the merch, then head to bhnshop.nz and you can get yourself some gear straight from BHN. I'm wearing the white one right here, the white hoodie, or you can get some of the bottom feeder gear, which you can get in hoodies or t-shirts, tan, rust, or black. I think all with, I know the tan's got black font. There you go. And you can pick that up by heading to bhnshop.nz. Tomorrow night, Thursday night, we will be cutting off the bottom feeders. There will be no more bottom feeders in this show. No more opportunity to get the bottom feeders. So if you want to support what we do and get some BHN merch, then all you need to do tonight is head to bhnshop.nz. It's as simple as that. Right, let's kick off the is this a best of show, a review show, whatever you call it show. Now obviously we've had the election. A lot of the content we've done from the last year has been election focused. So I've got you a few clips that might be election adjacent, still perhaps relative to where we are in the world today. For example, next we're going to hear from Professor Marriot from Victoria University from memory. We spoke to her in July on getting money out of New Zealand politics. So here's that interview for you right now. We welcome to the show from Victoria University of Wellington, Professor of Taxation, Lisa Marriot. Lisa, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's a very exciting time leading up to this election. I think 88 or 87 days to go, and everyone's all thinking about what's happening and what's coming up, and people are releasing policies, and academics are talking about fairer and better elections. And you've just done an article with Max Rashbrook headed "Tougher Donation Limits and Funding Fixes Would Make Future New Zealand Elections Fairer for All." There are some things in the article I really like to speak to, but to start off with, maybe as we always kind of do, I'll kind of just throw the ball to you and give you the floor, because we hear about money in politics, and I think most of us think about a broken American system, and we think about, freer and fairer is what we do in New Zealand, but your article doesn't quite sell it that way. Do you want to maybe break down some of the basics before we get into the actual details of the article as to why you've written this and what's it all about?
Yeah, sure. And actually, to your point, I think most of us agree we don't want a system like they've got in America, where you just 100%. Have enormous amounts of money thrown at politics. So Max and I spent actually pretty much most of last year working on a big report about political party funding. And one of the things that we did, look, we collected a lot of data from a number of different sources, but one of the things we did is we approached all the large donors over a specific period of time, so about 100 or so donors, and we asked if they would be happy to talk to us about why they donate. And to be honest with you, we actually did it because we assumed that nobody would want to talk to us, but actually quite a few people did. So we had some really good conversations with people who donate to political parties. Now, bear in mind, these, in order for us to know who's donating, these have to be the large donors. So they're the people who are donating over $30,000. So, these are the people who are donating the big money, really.
The Graham Harts of the world, the billionaires and the hundreds of millionaires of this world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because actually, you do have to be reasonably wealthy to be contributing those sorts of sums of money. So we had a talk to a number of different types of people across the political spectrum, and we asked them why they donate and what they get out of it. Now, nobody of course said to us, we donate because we think we can influence policy. Nobody's saying that, but certainly quite a number of people said to us they donate because it gives them greater access to people than they would potentially have otherwise. Now, access, of course, is not the same as influence. We're not saying it is, but there is a problem when wealthier people get greater access to the people who are making the decisions than,
Right.
the likes of other people who aren't making big donations and don't have similar sorts of access. Now, I know some politicians will say to you that they will give time to anybody, and I'm sure that is right for some of them. However, what we were made pretty aware of is that for people making larger donations, they expect a larger amount of contact with the people in power.
I'm sure there will be some highly ranked politicians whose number is in the phone numbers of some of these wealthy individuals. There's probably not so many solo mums with those same phone numbers.
That's exactly the point. Yeah. And so then you start asking the question of, okay, you've got the access. Even if you're making just small talk conversations, you're in the inner circle. You are much closer to influence than most of us.
I'd like to actually bring up some examples, because the article that you've written, which we'll get to as we're talking through, does specifically speak to some examples of what you were told. Obviously, you haven't identified who they were, but when you were talking to some of these wealthy donors, some of them said things like this. One of them noted that a real problem with people who accumulate a lot of money supporting the systems that have allowed them to accumulate a lot of money. There's another person that said that they did not think that it's right that rich people can distort democracy, although one of the ironies there, of course, is that not saying actively doing it, but potentially on some level that's actually what's happening if they've got access. And finally, not everyone was concerned about the situation, with one donor telling you guys, quote, "The fact that some can promote their position more than others doesn't worry me." So in other words, the fact that we with money can get onto the 9th floor, maybe not literally, but metaphorically speaking, no big deal. No big deal. That's a interesting, entitled opinion to have, I guess.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it is that sort of it's that sort of view that worries us. And the other thing is, of course, the majority of these large donations go to National and ACT. So they're going to the right. And whilst, you can make an argument that, of course, people are free, of course they are, to donate wherever they want. What we're not seeing is we're not seeing a more sort of balanced funding allocation to political parties in order that they can campaign on a more even playing field. Because we actually, in an ideal democratic system, we do want all parties to be able to effectively communicate their policies to the population, so the population's well informed and can make well-informed decisions about where their vote is going to go.
So you've said that the big donations go a lot to ACT and National, to the right. Yeah. When you're looking at things like what Martin Gillen said, which is that, I'm paraphrasing now, that the preferences of the poorer or middle class citizens aren't being represented as well, or aren't being chased as well, or advocated as well by these politicians. What they're advocating for seems to rest with the wealthy donors and what they want, or the sort of positions they would take. So what I'm wondering is, if the majority of the donations go to the right, to quote a word, is this an issue that goes across the political spectrum? So, for example, in Labour, do you still find that the preferences of the poorer or middle class citizens aren't being pushed or advocated as much by Labour, as opposed to what the wealthy donors may want unofficially as well? Or is this an issue for the right?
Well, it's a particularly topical question, isn't it, given the statement that was made by Labour about capital gains taxes and wealth taxes last week.
100%, yeah.
Yeah. We look, in fairness to Labour, they have done some things that, do, minimum wage increases and so on. And I'm not saying that there is no policy that it is not directed for those who have the least in society. But certainly last week's announcement appears to be directly targeting the most wealthy. If we look at who holds the wealth in New Zealand, it's the very, very top proportion of people. So yes, do I think the Labour Party have, are also trying to attract donations from traditional, perhaps right-leaning parties? Maybe. We don't actually have a lot of donors in New Zealand who contribute across the political spectrum. Most tend to be, either within that sort of ACT or National grouping or the Labour Green grouping. And then there's some other sort of others who float around with New Zealand First and so on. So we don't tend to see a lot of people, hedging their bets, if you like.
Let's have a look also at what the research is saying, or the report is saying recently. A final report delivered to the government in November, too late to have impact on this 2023 election, but there's been a report done, an interim report from the Independent Electoral Review as to how to make things fairer. Your article obviously touches on this as well. A few things that is suggested in the report: replacing the current broadcasting allocation with a fairer and more effective form of state funding for registered parties, per vote and base funding for registered political parties, tax credits for donations up to $1,000, introducing an expanded electoral access fund, and a new fund to facilitate engaging with Māori communities. I guess I was thinking as well about the what's changed ahead of this election. This one here I was thinking about. Changes included lowering the reporting threshold for large donations from $30,000 to $20,000 and new requirements around reporting donations above $1,500. Is this something that wealthy donors are trying to hide as well? Because there is a register of wealthy donors. I've seen it. And if you had to... is it a problem in New Zealand that people are going to, $29,999 so their names don't get made public? Is it going to make that big of a deal? Like I was going to say, Graham Hart gave hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to both National and ACT. We know that it's in the register. Are there going to be a group of people who are going to go, well, now that it's $20,000, I'm going to give $19,900, not $29,900? Is it going to make a difference, that particular idea, do you think?
Yeah, potentially, because for some of those donors, it's only a timing difference. So while that, you're right, the threshold for sort of, we'll call it immediate or reasonably quick disclosure, public disclosure of those donors has reduced from 30,000 to 20,000 for this year. And we should get those details within 10 days of those donations being made. But what will then also happen is with some of those changes that came in from the 1st of January this year, in their annual return, parties also have to report the details of names and addresses of donors where it's over $5,000. But we won't know that until their return, which will probably be April next year. Right. So at some point it will be visible, but it just won't be visible in the short term. One of the things we were told when we were talking to people is that people do like to be sort of invisible with their donation. Some of them, obviously if you're having a big donation, there's no chance that that's going to happen. But for some people, there was a bit of a concern that, perhaps you donate to one party and another party is forming government, whether that might perhaps have some implication to your business or whatever it is that you want to influence. If you have, essentially paid money to the wrong side. So there was a bit of a view of that. But now with that threshold being quite low for eventual disclosure of $5,000, actually, it will be interesting to see what happens to that sort of block of money and whether that has reduced quite a bit. Because previously we used to see that, again, that chunk of money, but at a higher threshold. So next year will be where the sort of the more interesting information comes out.
We hear the catch cry in America, get money out of politics.
Yeah.
And we hear them saying, looking to places like, I don't know if literally they look to New Zealand, but like New Zealand and Australia and the UK as the places, as I said earlier, where there's freer and fairer elections as it's seen in America. But the way you're describing it and the way that it's written, it doesn't sound like we've gotten money out of politics. And one last thing from the article, studies from overseas indicate those who raise the most money tend to win. And based on the recent donation research, donors know that too. Wealthy New Zealanders admitted to gaining access to the levers of power through political donations. Those that raise the most money tend to win. So therefore, money in politics is happening in New Zealand, maybe not to the same extent as we hear it in America, but is there a way to do it to actually get money out of politics? Or is it like everybody's right to be able to contribute financially to the political party. Where is that line between making it as free and fair as possible and also, I'm a fan of this golf club. I want to give money to this golf club. I'm a fan of this political party. I want to give money to this political party. How do we marry up those two things?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and absolutely can be done. Canada have done this really well, but there are different ways of doing it. It does involve a bit of state funding, but not a huge amount, it has to be said. So what Canada have done, if we start there, they have a really generous system of tax credits. And how a tax credit works is basically, if I donate $100 to my preferred political party, in Canada, that $100 would attract a 75% tax credit. So I would get $75 back. The party would get $100, and it costs me $25. So there's a very big sort of state contribution. Now, it abates. So the more I donate, the less tax credit I get. And at around about sort of $1,600, that's when I'm no longer getting any sort of tax credit for that. So, and if I had donated, say, $1,600, I'd be getting around about half of that back. Now, that's one way to really encourage people to think about donating to political parties, because a lot of people might want to donate, but could only donate a little bit. And, if it was going to cost you $25, but you knew your party was going to get $100, then, maybe that might be something people would do.
Yeah.
So there is that. There is other type of state funding, like per vote funding, and that normally has like maybe a lump sum payment from the government alongside it, because sometimes newer parties or smaller parties don't have enough votes to make that meaningful. But lots of countries do that approach as well. If you were to do the tax credit approach, and actually, to be honest with you, even if you did nothing, Max and I both agreed that capping the maximum amount that somebody can donate in any given year is a really good start. So even, if you kept it at $15,000 a year, so the maximum any person can donate is $15,000, that's still a reasonable sum of money. It's not probably enough to suggest that you might get any particular benefit from that, but it sort of has the potential to keep the real big money out of politics, which, certainly Max and I agreed would be a good step.
Right. So really the only way to do that is to make it like these people can give this much to this level, no more during the year. You can't give it 10 donations of that amount. But then if you can only give a maximum of $15,000, then $100,000 can't be given. Interested to think about, like we hear about bequeaths and that sort of thing, like when people have passed away and they leave a third of their estate to the Greens or something, there might have to be something written in it that would have still allowed that to happen, because who knows when that's going to happen. But either way, the way to get big money out of politics is to basically make it so you can't give big money. That's sort of what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like bequeaths, look, you could probably structure that so maybe it could be deleted over time. So $50,000 a year for 5 or 10 years, whatever it is. Max and I did do some numbers on the tax credit approach in New Zealand, basically taking the Canada model and sort of applying it here. And we calculated that for a cost, it will be a cost to the government, but a cost to the government of $2.35 per voter, you could have the same amount of funding, actually more funding, for the political parties than what they get from donations. We calculated this based on donations as it's sort of 2020, 2021. There was big money coming in last year, so probably wouldn't quite cover that. But $2.35 per voter, you could get rid of the large donors from the New Zealand political system, have a system of tax credits, and really get rid of all the potential issues with influence of a small number of people in that political environment.
So just for my clarity, if it was $2.35 per voter, does that mean per voter from the last election? So Labor had 1 million votes, National had 800,000 votes, so Labor gets 1 million times 235, National gets...
Oh, sorry.
So is that what you're saying?
No, I have not explained that very well. So no, what we did is we costed out like a tax credit system and how that might look in New Zealand. So we took basically sort of the amount of external funds that all the various political parties had raised around about the time of the last election, and then we looked we sort of modelled based on what happens in Canada, the proportion of people that vote, the amount of donations that those people vote, and what a system of tax credits would cost based on all those factors. So it wasn't actually applying that money to political parties as such, but we did, when we did the calculations, we calculated it to make sure that no political party would be worse off than what they currently are. And this is when we sort of crunched all those numbers, and it came out at $2.35. So the reason why we did this is just to show that it's not a particularly expensive exercise to put a bit of state funding into the sort of the political party finance, and then take out the private donations.
How would that state funding then get applied to the parties, or would it just be used, in other words, for a radio advertising, television? You give it to them almost like as a credit, because I think obviously you couldn't do it equally, because a smaller party is not going to get the same as what the national party would, and if you're going to base it on funding, that still means the bulk of it would go to the right, because that's where the bulk of the private funding goes right now. How would it get applied?
Yeah, so you're right. So the way the tax credit model works is, again, you're capping the maximum donation. So if you don't have a relatively small number of people making huge donations, you do lose that big money coming in. But what it also does is it facilitates a lot more of the smaller donations, and we did find quite. It does seem to work really well in Canada. They've had the system for quite some time, and the parties do get quite a good, there's quite a strong relationship between the number of votes that they get and the amount of funding that they get. So it does seem to actually manage itself. And I think a lot of that is because it does facilitate a lot of small donations, whereas here what we have is we have a small number of really large donations.
Gotcha. From the University of Victoria in Wellington, that is Professor Lisa Marriot, Professor of Taxation. Lisa, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate you giving us some thoughts. And if people want to check out more about this, go to The Conversation for your article.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Pat.
I feel like a radio announcer. That was Professor Marriot with that great hit. Coming up next is another great hit. Just kidding. Thanks for being with us tonight. This is a pre-recorded show. We appreciate you being a part of what we're doing. I want to also say, if you haven't done so far, if you would be so kind as to nominate us for the Listener's Choice in the New Zealand Podcast Awards 2023. All you need to do is go to nzpodcastawards.com and you can go straight there, /nominate, go into the nominate part, put the podcast name, which is obviously #BHN, or just call us Big Hairy News, your email address, and a link to the podcast. Now, the link to the podcast probably needs to be one of our audio links. I've put one in the description of this video so you can find it. Or if you're listening to this as an audio podcast, then you already have it. And then a comment about how fabulous we are in there as well, and that will nominate us for the Listener's Choice Award in this year's New Zealand's Podcast Award. A lot of people appreciate what we do. A lot of people thank us for what we do. A lot of people want to say, how can we help? Well, this is one way you can help. Mainstream media goes hard for the podcast awards now. We are up against the likes of RNZ, Newstalk ZB, New Zealand Herald, Stuff. So maybe you can help out our little old show, get somewhere in the Listener Choice nominations by heading to nzpodcastaward.com and do your thing. Remember, the link to the audio podcast is in the description of the video. Right, coming up next, we're going to have a look at a video that we made earlier this year. Did a little bit of analysis on how ACT uses a 3-step process for how they sow mis and disinformation. It's very, very clever what they do, how they make mis and disinformation seem authentic and general. They use a 3-step process, and that video is next. But what I want to share with you, right, is the 3-step process to mis and disinformation. The 3-step process that politicians use to mis and disinformation. The first thing they do, number one, is they outline a policy or a position. The second thing they do is they cite an incomplete, non-nuanced anecdote. And the third thing they do is they exaggerate or falsify a news story to back up your claim. Now, tonight's conversation is starring Brooke Van Velden from the ACT Party, but I suspect we could probably find examples of this from any political party, so let's be fair. All of which, especially the exaggeration and the falsification of a news story to back up your claim, gets no fucking pushback from the mainstream media. I actually think what we're about to show you almost requires a retraction from TVNZ Breakfast when you see how wrong what was just said on their program actually was. So let's go through this, right? And I'm going to show you some clips from things you've just seen, but they're only 20 seconds to demonstrate what we're doing. Step number 1, outlining a policy or a position. This is what Brooke, it's on 17, I'll just zip back to the start, sorry. This is what Brooke said.
Well, look, I think it's pretty clear that we need to send a signal that crime is not okay and there will be proper consequences for crime. Look, ACT and National reduced the age, so putting 17-year-olds before the youth court rather than the adult court back in 2016. That was wrong. What we've actually seen is that giving more criminals kindness and more personal responsibility hasn't worked. Kindness hasn't worked with these 17-year-olds, and in fact, offending is going up.
So, making it very clear that their position... Did I do sewing? Did I use the word sow again?
You did.
Where is it?
That's a bad pat.
I know. Where is it? Where did I use the word sow?
A top line.
Ah, there you go. That makes this whole argument null and void. So that is Brooke outlining a policy, or I even spell checked it, outlining a policy or a position like that they are needing to be harder on crime. The next thing they do is they then back it up with an incomplete anecdote or non-nuanced anecdote.
You know, I was talking to a liquor shop owner just last week who was really worried that she's been hit 3 times by youth offenders, and yet the police say there's nothing that we can do with these kids. We've got to actually set some proper consequences for crime and let these 17-year-olds know you will actually face proper consequences.
Like going to jail.
So there's the anecdote. I know someone, and remember we say this on the show all the time, that your personal lived experience, your anecdote might not necessarily be representative of the data. It might be, but it also might not be. And the third thing you do is you exaggerate or falsify a news story to back up your claim. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this. This is the story, the news story, that Brooke Van Velden exaggerated or falsified.
Actually, if you've got the case of, there was a 17-year-old who beat someone nearly to death in their own home and they didn't actually face any form of prosecution or harsh punishment, but that's not acceptable. We've actually got to take a hard line and say there are consequences for doing the wrong thing. There are right things and there are wrong things, and we should have gone back. This law change that we tried to do a few years ago by reducing people from the adult court into the youth justice court hasn't worked.
So the 3 steps are outline a policy or a position, to cite an incomplete, non-nuanced anecdote, to exaggerate or falsify a news story to back up your claim. This is what Brooke Van Velden just said. A 17-year-old who bet someone nearly to death in their own home and they didn't actually face any form of prosecution or harsh punishment. Remember that, Chewy? They didn't face any form of prosecution or harsh punishment. That's not acceptable. We're actually got to take a hard line and say there are consequences for doing the wrong thing. Really important line. They didn't face any form of prosecution or harsh punishment. Now, I've messaged Brooke Van Velden and I've messaged the Twitterverse saying, can we please just clarify what story we're talking about? Now, at the moment, the ACT Party are going around New Zealand talking about this story, right? Youths who beat 78-year-old in home and left for dead avoid jail. Here's why. So I am prepared to place any amount of money as a wager. This is the story that Brooke was talking about, right? And in this story, remember, what was the quote? They didn't actually face any form of prosecution or harsh punishment. Remember that. Here's the first part. The teens aged 16 and 17 at the time denied charges, that would be a charge, of aggravated burglary and causing grievous bodily harm. Their identities are suppressed as they were appearing in the youth court. Neither had previous convictions. The younger youth admitted the charges, that would be a conviction, admitted the charges on the second day of a 3-day trial late last year. So the younger offender, the 16-year-old, admitted the charges. But they're not talking about the 16-year-old. They're talking about the 17-year-old, because it's the 17-year-old they want to do. So the other was found guilty, that would be a conviction, by Judge McIntosh. Now, we probably need to look into this, and if you follow me on Twitter, you've already seen a little bit of this today. This is the 17-year-old. It would appear to me, and I could be wrong, but it would appear to me that the 17-year-old was not the main offender in this horrific aggravated assault, because the trial for the then 17-year-old ended on Wednesday. Judge Bridget McIntosh delivered her decision on Thursday morning. She said that while the evidence against the now 18-year-old had been circumstantial, it was significant and led her to find it beyond reasonable doubt that the teen had also been involved in the attack. Now, I would like clarity, but that seems to me that this is a person who was involved with the other person who was the main culprit. So if I'm correct that the 16-year-old is the main culprit because the 16-year-old admitted the charges on day 2, why aren't they saying lower the age to 16? Is it because that's a harder sell, or is it because, as Chloe's just talked about, it makes a good headline? So that's the first question to ask, right? Remember, we'll say it again, we'll show it again. They did not actually face any form of prosecution. Well, there's 2 convictions, so there must be a prosecution, or harsh punishment. Should we go on to that, shall we, Chewy? Should we go on to the harsh punishment part? Okay.
Yeah.
So Crown lawyer James Brigham said the offending was amongst the most serious of its kind and should be moved to the district court, where a sentence of imprisonment should be imposed in order to ensure the youth were held accountable for their actions. David Seymour at the moment is going around the country saying the prosecution said that these guys should have gone to jail. I'm like, well, so what? Of course the prosecution said that. I'm sure the defense said they shouldn't. Why is the prosecution the person now to base new legislation on? So what, you expect the Greens to go, well, the defense said, and that would be a good enough reason to make that argument? Bridgman, so this is the Crown lawyer, noted that the older youth, so that's the 17-year-old at the time, would soon turn 19, at which any youth court sentence must end, and this would not be appropriate for such offending. Lawyer for the younger youth, Richard Stone, right, so this is the 16-year-old, appears to be the more serious offender, said the youth had shown the victim, social workers, and his own family that he can obey rules and remain in the community. He said the assertion that the youth was associated with a mongrel mob was incorrect, and this was spelled out in a social worker's report, which said there had been no connection between him and the gang. But he acknowledged that he grew up, where he grew up meant he had been impacted by the mob. The youth had very troubled upbringing involving a jailed father, drug use, violence, family harm, and a number of referrals to Oranga Tamariki. Just the kind of kid you want to throw in jail, yeah? Stone said the youth had suffered from a bad assault at high school that had lasting impacts on him, including psychotic episodes, and family members said he had not been the same boy after it occurred. He said the youth had matured greatly since January of last year, the time of the assault. He had served 5 months in a youth facility, that sounds like consequences to me, and 11 months on electronic bail without breach. He had found work, had assisted helping others after Cyclone Gabrielle. It was noted that the youth had spent 5 months in youth residence and 11 months on electronic monetary bail, which was effectively the same as a 3-year prison sentence. Hang on, I'm confused, Chewy, because we were just told by Brooke Van Velden, like just a couple of minutes ago, I can't find it. Where's it gone? There it is. That there was no prosecution or harsh punishment. I guess you could say the term harsh is relative. Maybe that will be her defence. But the equivalent of a 3-year prison sentence doesn't seem like some kind of consequence. Before we go on, right? Before we go on, let's just look at what happened to the older youth. So here's the thing, yeah. So the younger offender, who may have been the more serious offender, looks like that this incident has got them to pull their socks up a bit and they're becoming a functional part of society, rather than sending them to what Bill English called the University for Crime, which is what he called a prison, right? The older youth's lawyer, Scott Jefferson, said the youth had experienced a very profound meeting with the victim's son, in which he gave a heartfelt and genuine apology for his actions. He said the youth had spent the past 16 months living in another region where he was working in a conservation role, living independently and in a very pro-social way. He had completed 56 hours of voluntary community work and had committed to complete 200 hours and was living with people who were addressing his substance abuse and dislocation from, is that right word? Dislocation from his culture. Mm-hmm. He said he was much different to the rudderless youth at the time of the assault. when he smoked cannabis every day, and Jefferson urged the judge to trust that he would continue on this path. Judge McIntosh acknowledged the youths had committed very, very serious offending, and their victim had lost the opportunity to grow old in a graceful way. She said that it had sent a ripple effect across many families and the wider community, which had been outraged, and at first blush, justifiably so. She said a prison sentence was a realistic outcome whenever someone offended the way they had, but she had to also consider youth court principles, particularly the need to keep young people in the community provided the community's safety was not at risk. And I think the evidence for that has been shown. At the end of the day, what we're doing is really looking into the future. It's the future of the youths and it's our community's future, she said. It was also important that young people knew that there would be punishment if they hurt people in an egregious way. So the judge is saying there was punishment. Brooke Van Velden saying there was none. We'll take that as read. Out of what was an awful situation that occurred on the 12th of January last year, there can be some kernels of hope that the two people involved will be much, much better people than they were. She said both youths had shown that they had learned and the time had come to work on a future. She ordered the older youth to attend drug and alcohol counselling, to make an emotional harm reparation payment of $2,000 to the victim's family, and complete 200 hours of community work. Now, you might say that the older youth seem to get away with a lot less of a punishment. That just reiterates the fact. They said the younger youth seem to, in a youth setting, seem to get about what the equivalent of a 3-year prison sentence was when it comes to time. The older youth didn't get that. That just leans again to the fact that he looks like he wasn't the serious offender in this assault. Not saying he was okay. It's a horrible situation. My heart breaks to think about a man not being able to grow old gracefully, as that thing says. But I also want to be fucking accurate. Now, the ACT Party are saying throw that 17-year-old in prison. That's what they're saying. Now, what we should want as society is pretty much everyone gets out of prison, right? Pretty much. When they get out of prison, we want them to be functioning members of society again. It seems to me that these people, these two young men, at the moment, can't predict the future, are becoming functioning members of society. Yep. Why would putting them in prison with this instance be any different? And the idea of what's impacted them to take them to this very bad situation that they've put themselves in, and worse for the victim. The ACT Party says the courts aren't doing anything, the police aren't doing anything, they didn't even prosecute them, which they did, there was no consequences, which there was, let's throw them in jail. Today's episode is brought to you by bhnshop.nz. Yep, that's right, Big Hairy News has merch that enables you to both support what we do and allows you to voice your political opinions via the international medium of clothing. Head to bhnshop.nz for this month's drop of either If the Left Vote, the Left Wins, or Christopher Luxon, not a businessman, just a board member, with free delivery in New Zealand. This month's drop ends July 20th, so be quick and head to bhnshop.nz to make your order and support what we're doing to fight mis- and disinformation this election cycle. That's bhnshop.nz.
So here's a couple of things I want to dive in. There's so much in this.
Yes.
I'm going to go on a fucking tear, I'll tell you now.
Go.
We spoke the other week about cultural reports.
Yeah, exactly.
You just read one.
Yes, I did.
We now know the cultural reasons that brought that kid to where he was. We know his history. And you know what? His history is also his potential future. His father was jailed. There was drug use, assault, and you start to see the seeds of that and where he was before this intervention, before this horrible assault.
Yeah.
So he was already going down that path. If Brooke and the guys in ACT with the big old hard-on for crime and punishment had their way, this kid would be off to an adult prison at 17. He'd be out in, say, less than 5 years with none of those problems solved and even more problems added. Now we have a completely broken person in his early 20s. Hey, maybe he meets someone. Maybe he knocks her up. Now we've got another kid in that cycle. It's a never-ending cycle of broken people. But what we have here is that we have an intervention. We have a moment where this intense response from government agencies and the community just wrap around this kid. They do the work, they find out what put him on that path, and they try to push him off it. And you know what it is? It's worked.
Yeah.
Everything in that story says that it's worked. He's found work. He's connected more with his culture. He's followed the rules. Yes, he's been involved in something horrible, but hopefully that'll be the last one.
Yeah.
You know, kids do stupid things. Teenagers have shithouse impulse control, even if they're good kids with good upbringings. You add the mess that kid's had to deal with, it's almost inevitable that something like that is going to happen. We need to intervene earlier. We need to get that wraparound care earlier. We need to break that cycle earlier, and then we wouldn't even be having this conversation about whether we want to send literal children to prison.
Yeah. Just this comment here from Angus just today. Angus says we'd rather spend $130,000 per year locking a person up rather than investing in their future. Of course, it's $200,000, $193,000. So yeah, where would that 100? So these guys are in prison for 3 years. Let's say there's $600K gone, or they're out working in the community, you know, growing up, being an impact for community, and actually, I guess kind of, you know, it's punitive to go, let's lock them up because they suffer a penalty, but society gets nothing out of it. And probably what society gets is when they come out, they're worse people and they're going to go straight back to it. Whereas they don't suffer that same kind of lock them up mentality, they go into society wins better. Not every time. I'm not saying it's I'm not being all moonbeams and rainbows and that kind of stuff. But in this instance,
no one's batting 100. No,
not in this instance. Following it on, actually, society is the group that's got the best deal out of this. We've spent less on them, which I don't really care about the money, but let's just be real. We've spent less on them, and they've become more productive members of society, and they're out and about helping in society based on being forced to by the courts and obviously by choice as well. We're reading Cyclone Gabrielle situations. Rather than sitting in a prison cell, working out each day, maybe getting more prison tats, maybe actually signing into more gang activity because they need protection in that prison as well. Coming out of that prison, owing something to Black Power, mongrel mob, whatever, because they just sign up with them inside prison. And now you've actually got a fully fledged gang member coming out of prison rather than a teenager with no affiliation, according to the social worker, helping in society. It just seems, it seems so silly. And look, let me say this one more thing. We're not batting 100, Chewy, but what ACT is doing right now is they're giving singular examples to make their point. So why can't we use this as our singular example to make our fucking point? The dairy owner was their singular example. So here's our singular example of how this system's better. Full stop.
So we come back to something I've mentioned previous, is it depends on what problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah.
Are they trying to solve youth crime or crime rates in general? Is that the problem that they're trying to solve? Because we know from research and statistics and reports out the arse that this doesn't fix those problems. So then they must be trying to fix another problem, Pat. Do you think that problem is that they're not the government?
Yeah, I think they're trying to solve the problem of getting more votes.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
And this is very effective at solving that problem.
G'day team, there you go. That is how we think ACT uses a 3-step process for sowing mis and disinformation. I want to say a huge thanks to all our patrons who are always with us all the time. We love you guys to bits. If you're not a patron yet and you'd like to be a part of what we do in a monthly kind of a way, then you can head to patreon.com/bighairynews. You can see there we put up early interviews. When we record an interview during the day, we put it up early. We interact with you guys. If you join a certain level, we actually give you some rewards, t-shirts and hoodies and caps and that kind of stuff as well. But if you've always been interested in getting behind us, I appreciate you guys who have gotten the merch and helped us out that way. This is a way that some people do, you know, a $5 or a $10 or a $15 a month help. That does certainly help to pay a few of the bills around the place. Patreon.com/bighairynews. We appreciate you guys being involved as a part of what we do. In fact, that's scrolling along the bottom of the screen at the moment as well. If you've ever thought about how you could help out, this is definitely a way you could help out, to go to patreon.com big hairy news. Okay, so in April of this year, we had a report out. The IRD told us that New Zealand's wealthiest families were not paying their fair share of tax. Again, we're not really talking, obviously, election or politics so much in this pre-recorded show because the election is over. However, this election will now flow into conversations around things like wealth tax and capital gains tax and those at the top not paying their fair share. So here's an interesting conversation from April of this year around the story that the IRD told us. They told us that the wealthiest families were not paying their fair share of tax. That is the next conversation. Thanks very much. Here it comes. All right, big news in New Zealand today is it seems like the uber wealthy, 311 I think it was, of the richest families in New Zealand were studied by IRD and have come out to be paying about, in total, once you add everything up, 9% tax on their earnings. Let's have a look at the story.
Now, you might like to be sitting down to hear this.
I am.
New research has found the wealthiest handful of Kiwi families are each worth an average of $276 million.
And they're effectively only paying half the tax of everyday Kiwis. The Revenue Minister says it shows in black and white that the tax system is unfair, but as political reporter Amelia Wade explains, he has no plans to fix it yet.
Wealth.
Oh,
We
Chewy.
all
There's our
mostly
delivery from
dream of
Jacinda.
it, but what is it?
You've got hundreds of thousands left over at the end of the week. You're wealthy.
Having lots of disposable income.
I regard myself as wealthy in the sense that when I go to the supermarket, I don't have to worry about, being able to pay the bill when I get to the checkout.
Turns out the most minted among us have substantially more than a shopping trolley. Try a collective wealth of $85 billion.
This finding is truly groundbreaking.
Thanks to a law change, the tax department spent 2 years and $3.2 million investigating the financial affairs of the richest 311 families.
For the first time, we have hard data confirming fundamental unfairness in our tax system.
That unfairness is because most Kiwis are taxed on every dollar they earn, as well as paying GST. So middle-income New Zealand effectively pays 20.2% in tax. But these high wealth families effectively pay just 9.4%. That's because they don't grow their wealth from income. Most of it is from other largely untaxable things like trusts, property and investments.
When I say most, I mean 93%.
I don't think that's okay. It's disgusting.
Looking at their properties alone, the wealthy families own almost 7,000.
The top 1% of households hold more than a quarter of all of the financial assets in New Zealand.
Let me just spell that out again. They said 311 families. 311 families own 7,000 properties. I haven't even done this yet, and I probably could do it in my head if I was a bit better. What is that? So we'll go 7,000, divided by 300. Yeah, so that's about 22 properties each of the families owns. So good, bad, or indifferent, you can decide on that, but that's what the number is. And obviously some of them will own 5 properties and other ones will own 40, but it's a lot of properties amongst 300 families.
And the rich are really getting richer. In 2017, the families were worth $1 billion. In 2021, that was $14.6 billion. The opposition accusing Labour of planting a seed with the public about tax changes.
The top 2% of New Zealanders are paying about 26% of all our income tax, and I think that is entirely fair.
The government will use...
National's in a quandary here. Because what you're finding, and we're going to play some clip from Mr. Luxon shortly, is National are basically now saying these top families have earned too much money. Yet National is the party of the wealthy and uber wealthy, telling their supporters that they shouldn't be becoming wealthy or uber wealthy. And if you were a National Party and you came out and you said, well, the wealth of individuals has gone up by X amount of percent during our term, you'd probably celebrate that. But the wealth of the Labour during this Labour incumbent government, they've gone up by such a large amount, and National's trying to sell it as a bad thing. Now, it is a bad thing, but it's also National's bread and butter. So I think they're in a bit of a quandary here as to what to do. So what National is saying is Labour is better for the uber rich. Is that what they're saying? Because that's the outcome.
And I think that is entirely fair.
The government will use this report as part of a witch hunt, but witch hunts won't make us wealthier.
The government's research has outlined that they can do things differently, and this is their call to action.
The tax system is unfair. Do you have the courage to fix it?
This annoys me.
Yes.
Just not today.
But we
this
have
annoys
made it
me.
clear that we're not making significant tax changes today.
Well, what annoys me is the big long pause.
Oh, and the grin.
Yeah, that annoyed me.
Didn't like the grin.
No, this has got about 60 seconds. Let's just play the end of it.
And probably not tomorrow either.
Well, Amelia joins.
Oh, that'll do. We don't need the commentary afterwards. Now, I'll show you what Luxon did. Now, this is a clip from what the Luxon was talking in that conversation. Except I sometimes think this is one of the things I like about hanging out with you guys and having as much time as we want. Yeah, because some of the more interesting things from his media scrum aren't shown in a 2-minute clip, right? Now, I'll read out to you what happens. You're not going to hear it very well because reporters, for some reason, don't put the mic to their own mouth. They only hold it out to him, so you can't hear him. 4 times in a row, Christopher Luxon has asked if he thinks that the tax system is fair. 4 times in a row by 2 different reporters. This isn't verbatim, but it's the basic question. The first question is, do you agree that the tax system is unfair? The second question is that tax system itself unfair? The third question is, the wealthiest 300 families pay 9% tax. Do you think that's fair? And the fourth question is, in terms that the wealthy pay half what the ordinary Kiwi pays, is that fair? Now, even if you don't hear the questions, you'll hear Luxon pausing. All 4 of these questions, he's asking, do you think the tax system is fair? At no point does he answer the question.
What I agree is that this government's been incredibly unfair on working
Is the tax
New
system
Zealanders
unfair?
because
That's
they've actually
not the
mismanaged the economy,
question.
created inflation, and caused huge amounts of pain and suffering.
Didn't create inflation.
And what
Is it unfair?
What I'd say to you is what is unfair is that this government has actually had policies that have inflated asset values where the wealthy have done incredibly well. If I compare and contrast the national period in government versus the Labour period in government,
Do you think
by
that the
virtue of their
wealthiest 300
economic
families
mismanagement, the printing of money,
paying 9%
the
is fair?
spending of
That's the
money.
next question.
This is a government that is proportionally the second biggest spending government in the OECD. It's proportionally the 4th biggest printer of money in the OECD. And it restricted our economy and shut down our immigration centres like nothing else, spiked domestic inflation and created a huge asset class.
Talking
growth in
points.
asset
Talking-
class.
So the wealthiest 311 families in the country pay about 9% tax versus median New Zealanders who pay about 20% tax.
Yeah.
To you, is that fair?
The top 2% of New Zealanders are paying about 26% of all our income tax, and I think that is entirely fair. We need to be in a place with this economy at the moment.
We'll come back to that.
Crying out for investment and capital to grow the economy. But what's happening here? Be under no illusion. It's not the wealthy that are the problem here. The problem here is the government that had economic policies that led to a massive inflation in asset classes that are nominal. They haven't always.
And he
been
avoids the
realised,
question so much that another reporter comes on and says, like the last reporter was asking you, do you think it's fair? And he still doesn't answer it.
That's very different from how a national government ran things. When you have good economic management, you don't create a condition where that happens.
You keep blaming the government, but it was the... We hear you on the economic management points, but back to Amelia's question. This report was about the system, the tax system. So in terms of that disparity between the wealthiest paying half of what the ordinary Kiwi pays, is that fair?
What I'm just saying to you is the fairness. No, it's really grossly unfair that we've got a government that has mismanaged the economy so badly.
God's sake,
that
man!
Anyway,
we'll fade it out. So you get the idea. Now, I want to put something to bed, right? I nearly made the worst joke in the world. And the idea that the top 2% pay 20%, 26% of the tax. Let's make this really clear, right? I've said this before on the show and I'll say it again. If I make $1 million a year and Chewy makes $100,000 a year, good money, great. And let's not even say that. If Chewy makes $40,000 a year and I make $1 million a year and I pay 20% of my tax, so I'm left with $800,000, and Chewy pays 10% of his tax and he's left with $36,000. Who is impacted more? Chewy is impacted more because he has less. I'm hardly impacted at all, but I've paid far more. So just because they pay more in the hat doesn't mean they're paying their fair share, because those who have less and perhaps put less in the pot but proportionally pay more are impacted worse. 20% out of a pension is $28,000 impacts them a lot more than 40% out of a millionaire's salary. So when you hear people like Luxon say the top 2% pay 26% of the tax, it's a bait and switch to say they put more in the pot, but they put less proportionally compared to what they earn in the pot, even though it's more financially, if that makes sense. Really important to remember.
I've got a solution.
Nationalise it?
I love solving problems. No, that's my solution.
What, let them eat cake?
Guillotine time. No, it's enormously frustrating to see Luxon completely, like, A, dodge the question. 3, well, 2. B, did I say A or 1? I don't know. I'm so fizzing at the moment. It's just throwing out bullshit left and right like they're smoke grenades to try and duck being pinned down on this issue. And then just apparently demonstrating a complete lack of understanding about how inflation works and what got this country into the position with these dragons sitting on accumulated piles of gold going, no, daddy, don't tax me. And I'll tell you, every government since the late 80s has put a brick in this wall. When they redid the tax in the late 80s, they dropped the top tax rate from 66% to 33%. They got rid of a land tax. And at that point, everyone went, well, we don't have a capital gains tax. We don't have a land tax. Then buying property is tax free. So that's what I'm going to do with my money. So if you wanted to grow your money, you start gobbling up houses about the same time that a national government is selling off state-owned assets and state-owned houses. You start hoarding up properties that the country built for you. And then you make your money by buying and selling houses amongst yourselves and producing nothing. Like people in New Zealand, the rich, most of them don't invest in productive assets like businesses or that sort of thing. They'll invest in property because it's safe and there are no tax considerations. Go hard. Hoard up 7,000 properties over a decade of a housing shortage. What absolute ghouls. And the fact that Luxon cannot see that or will not admit it is infuriating because it means that he has no way of solving this.
Yeah, it's fair. What you're saying is fair. I'm just reminded as well, and I'm having a look for something while I'm talking to you, so I might be a little bit distracted here. I'm reminded of speaking to Don Brash about becoming the Prime Minister, and I remember talking to Don. Remember talking to Don Brash. Let's see if I can find it. I'm just looking at my SoundCloud to see if it's up there. No, that's not that one.
Well, just while you're looking.
Yeah. I can't see the screen, by the way, so if you want to do something.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
What have you done? Well, do I have to come over and check
nothing.
on you?
No, you just carry on with your life. That's fine.
I do have it here. This is an old, I wonder if I can do this. I wonder if I can find it. This is probably
now, for I do it for you in the chat, Labour are no different. That's pretty much exactly what I said. Is that both major parties have built this up over the last 40 years. They've all had recommendations. They've all had people look at the tax code and where people are funneling their money. You can't say that either one of them didn't know. National didn't want to do it because they'd hurt their friends or their own portfolios. Labour didn't want to do it because they didn't have the bollocks to do it when they had the ability.
Which is why when David Parker laughs, I'm like, fucking hell.
That's why I got angry.
The answer is yes, we're going to fix this, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But here's what I was trying to find. I found it, but I have to log in to get access to my own audio, so I'm not going to do that. I spoke to Don Brash, whatever it was, 2008, and I said to him, and the thing that reminds me of this is Mr. Luxon has said this in the last month. Don Brash said the same thing. It's a job interview. and I'll find out at the end of the year if I get hired for the job. And I played Don Brash the audio of him talking to Duncan Garner about sending troops into probably Afghanistan. And Duncan Garner asked 4 times, but Mr. Brash, would you have sent troops into, and the response was, this is a diversionary tactic. And so I sat in front of Don Brash and I said to him, you've said that this is a job interview. And he said, yes. I said, explain to me how in a job interview you can choose not to answer questions. If I go to a job interview working for JB Hi-Fi and they say, how good are you on the till? This is a diversionary question. It's not relevant to the job I've got at hand. It's like in a job, and if we ever get Mr. Lux, which I don't think we will, but if we do, I will use this clip and I will say to him exactly the same question. How can you expect to get a job when you're not answering questions in the interview process? You've chosen not to answer questions. You yourself have said this is a job interview. You've used that term. You're getting asked questions and you're not answering them. How can you expect to get a job when you don't answer the questions that are coming to you for that job? Now, what can we do? Chewy wants to have a guillotine. We've had this before. Look at that beautiful look at that little fella. Look at that little fella just there. Beautiful little fella hanging out with us. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but we did this last year in quite depth. You can go find it for yourself. When tax breaks for everyone leads to some paying more tax, tax-free thresholds explained. This is a very basic example based on the Australian system, that if we made it tax-free for under $14,000, this is the current tax system in New Zealand up the top here, 14,034, so it goes 14,000, the next band is 34, the next band is 22, the next band is 110. This is the bands up here. And if you made the tax-free on the first $14,000 and you increase the rate on the following bands, which is what Australia has done, and these bands are based on the Australian model, people who are, this is about the pension, 28,000, they'd be like $1,400 a year better off, $30 a week. People on $50,000 would be about the same. They're around $1,000 better off. People on 100,000 would be paying a bit more, and the tipping point for that kind of system is for the system that I propose is $80,000. So in the current tax system, if you're paying, and that doesn't include working for families, that doesn't include family tax credit, it's purely PAYE. The current tax system, if you're doing $80,000, doesn't include student loans, you pay $17,320. On the proposed new system, my proposed system, on $80,000 you'll be earning $17,310. That means everyone under $80,000 would have more in their pocket. The squeezed middle, Mr. Luxon, for the cost of living crisis, and everyone above it would start paying a little bit more by a little bit more by a little bit more. As you can see here, if you're earning $300,000 under the current system, just PAYE, $97,000. Under the new system, $108,000. That would be the system that I would suggest. We've done it before, and that would be a way that you could do
before?
it.
The country
Australia?
that we're always compared to, Australia.
Yeah. That everyone's now going to move to
where things are better and people earn more money,
except
and that sort of thing. So why do we look to the Australians for fucking stupid ideas and we don't get this one? It's infuriating.
That's
right?
an idea.
Whenever these guys talk about tax, it's like they forget that we have a progressive tax system for a start. They love to trail that out there, that if you're in a different tax bracket, people absolutely don't understand what that means. It's the illiteracy. It's the what did I say? The intellectual dishonesty that makes me really, really angry. And this is something that could make quite a big difference into a lot of people's lives, and make the tax system more progressive, and get the money that we need to get to keep things like the luxuries in this country, like hospitals and schools and such. When everybody looks to the good old days, they never look at the tax rate, right?
Yeah, that's true. They just look at separate water drinking fountains. That's the great times, wasn't it? Separate drinking fountains.
Like in the States, they're always going, oh, look, remember when America was great and we had a massive navy and we could fight 2 wars at once. We went to the moon at the same time. And you go, well, what was your tax rate at that point?
Yeah, 100%.
Oh, you were taxing millionaires at 80%. That's why you were able to do it.
So this is what's probably, I reckon, is going to happen. There will be a pretty massive announcement from Labor. I don't know what. I wouldn't be surprised if there was capital gains tax. And capital gains tax is not going to be a winner for Labor, because there are a lot of Labor voters who won't be that interested in it. But could be. But the I keep saying interest-free, the tax-free band could be announced, and what they'd be saying is, and it will be introduced budget 2024. In other words, if you want it, you better put us back in. All right, team, that's us. Thanks for being with us tonight. Love you to bits. Appreciate you very, very much. Thank you for being a part of what we do. And we will be back live tomorrow night from 9 p.m. for another edition of Big Hairy News. Nothing else really to tell you. Follow me on Twitter at Pat Brittenden if you want to get that merch. bhnshop.nz, patreon.com/Big Hairy News if you want to be a part of what we do. And also remember, feel free to nominate us for the New Zealand Podcast Awards, the listener's choice. All of those things, they're in your hand, and they can happen if you make it happen like that. All right, team, all the best. Catch you tomorrow. Hooroo.